Hi everybody, and welcome to the next video on functions. In this video we investigate two different ways of handing parameters to functions. So you can either give a function a parameter by value, or you can give a function a parameter by reference. So I'm going to explain the difference between these two things as we move through the video, but the easiest way to illustrate the difference is just to show you an example. So let me come over here to my compiler. So far the main function is empty. I haven't done anything yet. Focus on these two functions here. So this first function is our string find function. So it's the function that lets you look for a substring inside of a bigger string, and you tell the function where you want it to start looking, and it returns -1 if it doesn't find what you are looking for. So here's the code for that function. Now we wrote that function for a number of reasons, but one of the reasons is because we could use it in this function down here. This function is the bad to good function, and what it does is it accepts a string, and every instance of bad is erased and replaced with good, and every instance of worst is replaced with best. And then when we're done making those changes, we return the new string that we have created that's more positive than the original string. Okay, so we've seen this function before. We gave it a different name maybe, but this is just the function that you handed a string. The string that gets returned is the original string with all bads replaced with goods and all worsts replaced with bests. So keep that in mind. That's what this function does. So let me now come up here in main. Let me declare a string and let me get it from the user. Okay, now what I want to do is, maybe the user gives me a very negative string, right, that has all sorts of bads and worsts in there, and I don't like that. I want the string to be positive. So maybe I'll write a line of code like this: bad to good input. Okay, so notice there's no like yelling. The compiler doesn't yell at me here. You can write a command like this. Just, I'm going to feed input into the function bad to good. And now let me see out that string. Okay, so what's going on here? I declare a string, I get it from the user, I feed that string into the function bad to good, and then I output the result. So before I hit run here, and before I do anything, you might want to think about what should happen. But let's just run this. So let me just type bad, bad, hi there, worst, bad. So a very negative string. So the computer is going to get this and save it as input, and then it's going to feed that into bad to good, and then it's going to print that string. So notice what happened. I fed this input, which was bad, bad, hi there, worst, bad. I fed that into this bad to good function, but then when I printed the result, nothing had changed. Right, so I fed this input here into the function and nothing happened. So let me now do something else. Let me now, right here, do this. String new string equals bad to good input, and now let me print new string. Now what's going to happen is what you basically want to happen. So let me input the same thing. Bad, bad, hi there, worst, bad, and now it prints this new string, which is good, good, hi there, best, good. Okay, so let's go down to the function and let's analyze exactly what happens. What did I call this here? Input. Okay, input is the name of the variable inside main. That variable gets fed into this function, and what happens is input takes the place of my string. Okay, so my string is just a placeholder for anything you want to pass to the function. So what happens is input right here has the value bad, bad, hi there, worst, bad. So what happens when you get to this function is this function creates a new string that's called myString. It declares a new variable. And myString is this bad, bad, hi there, worst, bad. So this is all done by the code itself, but what's really happening is there's like an implicit line of code that's like this. That's implicitly done by the function. You don't have to do it. And notice it yells at me because it doesn't, at this point, it doesn't know what input is, right? Input is defined up here in main, and different functions don't see the variables inside of each other. So if I write this explicitly, it doesn't know what I mean. But this line of code is implicit right here and up here when I actually feed input into the function. Okay, so what's happened is the value of input, all right, so this bad, bad, hi there, worst, bad, the value of input has been fed in, and now my string has that value. So when you're messing with my string down here, my string has the same value as input, so you make all these changes to my string, and then you return the result. So what happens is a new string is created called my string, and that new string you mess with, and then you return that. Okay, so back up here in main, at this point in the code, if I have the cout, oops, put it right here, cout input, even though you have fed input into this function and then you've made a bunch of changes, right? You fed input in right here, you made a bunch of changes, and then you returned something. Even though you made all of those changes inside of this function, back up here, main doesn't remember those functions. So the value of input is not changed. So in other words, what has literally happened? What has literally happened is you've passed the value of this variable to this function. You've passed this parameter by value. On the other hand, you have not passed the variable itself. The variable itself is off on its own and not being changed. What you did was you passed the value of this variable to this new myString variable, and now this new myString variable, that's where all the changes happen, and you return something, right? But this input itself, this variable, is off on its own. It's not being messed with when you feed it into this function. Input is not being messed with. The value of input is being messed with and then is returned as something else. Okay, but back up here in main, if you feed input into this bad to good function, the original string stays the same. You can create a new string if you want to. That's the result of the value of input being messed with. But the variable input itself is left alone. Okay, so that's passing by value. That's what we've been doing all this time. We haven't actually been passing this variable to the function. We've only been passing the value of that variable to the function. This variable itself is sort of locked away and not being messed with. Okay, suppose now though that you want this code to work like this. So let me get rid of new string. You want to feed the string input into this bad to good function and have the changes you've made remembered. So you literally want this variable changed now. You don't just want to make a copy of the variable and change that copy and return the copy, right? That's what's happened before. You literally want to write a line of code like this that says, hey, this input string, please make it positive. How would that look? Well, now, if you want that to work, you need to not just pass the value of this variable, you need to pass the variable itself. If you pass the variable itself, then any change made to the variable inside of the function will be remembered back up here in main. Okay, so let me show you how that works. Let me make a new function. So I have to give it a new name, but this new function will do what we just said. So I don't need to return anything because I'm just going to change this variable itself. I don't need to make a copy and return the copy. And I have to give it a new name because I already have an old name, bad to good. I'm going to make one slight tweak here though, and now instead of just telling it, hey, I'm going to pass you a string, I'm going to write an ampersand there. What that does is it now tells the function, I'm not just going to pass you the value of a string. I'm going to pass you a variable itself. I'm going to pass you a string variable. And then any change you make to this variable will be remembered back up in main. So let me just declare this variable down here, sorry, this function. And let me take this bad to good code and just copy it. So the idea is still the same. I'm going to give you a variable now, and now input takes on the role of my string, just like it did before, but now my string literally is the variable input. So any change you make to my string will also be made to that input variable up top. So all of these changes here that you make will be remembered back in main. So let me come up here in main, and now instead of passing to the bad numeral good, let me do like this. Okay, and let's now see what happens. So I'm going to do bad, bad, hi, there, worst, bad. And notice now I fed input in, but since this bad to good function with the actual word to, since I passed the variable itself and not just the value of the variable, this function here does not create a copy of any variable. There's no copies being made. You are giving it literally the variable input. Therefore, down here inside the function, bad to good, to, input becomes this variable myString, and there's no copy made. All you've done is relabel what the variable is called. But now when you make all these changes to myString literally is the variable input. So you are literally changing the variable itself, that input variable, and when you literally change the variable itself, that means that back up here in main, you remember those changes you've made. Okay, so hopefully this example has been illustrative, but this is the difference between passing by value, which this function does. So when you pass by value, you make a copy of the original variable, and then you mess with that copy. So changes that are made inside of a function aren't remembered up in main. But here when you're passing by reference, which is what this is called, passing by reference, you are not making a copy of the variable you are passing. You are passing the original variable itself. Therefore, any changes you make will be remembered back up in main. Okay, so the point of this video is just to show you multiple examples of this and see why it works, and see how it works, and see why you would want to do such a thing. So continuing with the thread of that example, there are two ways you can hand a parameter to a function. You can hand it by value or by reference. In this example here, well, this first function here, I'm handing the parameter by value. I'm not handing the variable itself. I'm making a copy of the variable and just transferring the value from one to the other. In this function right here, though, I'm passing by reference. I'm handing the function the variable itself. So those are two ways you can hand a function a parameter. To pass a variable by value means that only the value of the variable gets passed to the function, not the variable itself. The variable itself is sort of locked away in a safe place, if you like, and only the value of the variable gets handed to the function. The function creates a new variable to store this value that's being passed to it, and any change that's made is made to this new copy variable here. By contrast, to pass a variable by reference means that you pass the variable itself, not just what the current value of the variable is. In this case, the function doesn't need to create a new copy variable because the function has been handed the original variable. The main difference between passing by value and passing by reference is this. If you pass a variable x by value, the value of x is not changed in main. So whatever happens inside of the function to this variable x is forgotten back up in main. So once the function is done running, the value of x has not been changed inside of main. All right, so that's what happened. I should stop minimizing this. That's what happened here. So if I do this bad to good function and I give it input, at this point in the code, the value of input is the same as it was before, because this bad to number 2 good function was passed by value, which means that this variable here is not messed with inside of main. Only the value of it is messed with, and then you return a copy variable. In contrast though, and that's why, let's just run this again. So this first cout statement will be for this pass by value function. The second cout statement will be for this pass by reference statement. So hi there, bad, bad. good, worst. So this first cout statement, even though you fed, even though you fed this variable into a function, right? The changes to this variable aren't remembered in main because you didn't pass the variable itself. You passed its value. But right here, you passed the variable itself. And therefore, this input right here, right, this is what input is changed inside of main. So up here in main, I remember what happened to me inside of that function. And what happened to me? Well, all the bads became goods and all the worsts became best, and I remember that. Okay, so we're going to look at a couple of examples of this. And the first thing we should investigate is, why would you pass something by reference? You know, I mean, what do you gain by doing this? It's sort of confusing to have two different ways of passing variables, right? We were doing just fine before, passing by value. You know, that's what we've done now for a week or so. So why would you now introduce this concept of passing by reference? Well, one thing you might want is you might actually want to change the value of the variable in main. You may want to remember changes you've made. Okay, and this just depends on what kind of code you want to write, you know, but back up here in this example, maybe you want to feed input into this function and have the value of the variable changed. You know, if you want that, then you'll have to pass by reference. But on the other hand, maybe you don't want the value changed and you want to write code like this. Which one? Oops, input. So right here, nothing has changed, right? So this line of code doesn't do anything. Right here, though, you can create a copy, a new string, sorry, and let the new string be the return value of the bad to good function. So if you just don't want to change the original variable and you are willing to create new variables to record changes, then you want to pass by value. But maybe you really want the value of this variable changed. You know, maybe you don't want to make copies and you don't care about remembering what the string used to be. Then you can pass by reference, and you don't need to have lines of code like this. Okay, so that's one reason why you might pass by reference. You really want the value of the variable changed. One of the primary uses of passing by reference is that you can now trick a function into returning more than one value. So we're going to flesh this out in a second, but before we do, remember that a function can only return one value. Okay, you can feed a function as many inputs as you want. You can feed it as many parameters as you want. But a function by definition can only return a single value. Okay, well sometimes though you want it to return more than a single value. And there are various ways you can do this. If you want to return more than one value, maybe you can return a vector, where the entries of that vector are the multiple return values that you want. You know, so there are ways of tricking a function into returning more than one value. But a natural way to do it is by passing by reference. And so let me just give you an example here. Suppose you want to write a function that solves a quadratic equation. You know, ax squared plus bx plus c. Then what you'd really like is you'd like a function that returns these two values, because these are the two solutions to that quadratic equation. Of course, if they exist. You know, when you're taking square roots of things, you might get non-existent solutions, right? But you'd like a function that basically gives you these two values back, if they exist. So initially you might think to yourself, well, that's a problem because functions only return a single value. Okay, so how can I get this function to return these two values? Well, one answer is you can pass the solutions themselves by reference. So let me show you how that looks. So let's write a function that's called solve quadratic equation. If you want to solve a quadratic equation, you of course have to feed it the coefficient values, and let's just assume for now that those coefficient values are integers. You know, they don't have to be necessarily, but let's just suppose they are. And then let's pass it a couple of solution variables by reference. Okay, so what's going to go on here? I'm going to hand this function the three parameters that correspond to the equation. inside of the function itself, I'm going to find those two solutions. And I'm going to save those two solutions in this variable and this variable. Since you have passed by reference these equations that you will write that save the two solutions, those equations are remembered back in main. Okay, so rather than explaining this more, let me just write the function itself and let's see how it works. So right here, well, what do we want to have happen? We want solution 1 to be, let's see, negative b plus, let's do the plus version first, square root b squared minus 4 times a times c, and we want that to be divided by 2 times a, and we want solution 2 to be the same thing, but the negative version. Okay, so let's come back up here in main. Let's declare int a, b, c. Let's not worry about user output right now. Let's just get those three numbers from the user. And now let's create a couple of variables that will hold the solutions for us. And now what you can write is just this sort of pseudo-English here. Solve this quadratic equation for me, please. So I'm going to hand you a, b, and c, right, the user numbers. And then I'm going to hand you these two variables, x1 and x2, that right now are empty. And actually, sorry, as I said before, when you have square roots floating around, you need to make sure that you're not taking a square root of a negative number. So let's just make sure we don't do that. So if b times b minus 4 times a times c, if that is negative, then we know there's no real solution. So let's just say that. So we don't even need to bother trying to solve anything. If there is a real solution, though, we should solve it. Okay, so what have we done? We've gotten the three coefficients from the user. We've created a couple of variables to store the solutions in. And if there is no solution, we don't worry about solving. But if there is a solution, we now write this line of code. Solve the quadratic equation, right? Solve the quadratic equation corresponding to a, b, and c. And please store the solutions in these two variables. So x1 gets passed by reference as solution 1. x2 gets passed by reference as solution 2. And so therefore, in the code up here in main, x1 will now be this value. And x2 will now be this value. Okay, so the changes that you're going to make in the function to x1 and x2 are remembered here in main. And so just like when you guys wrote your own quadratic equation solver, if the two solutions are the same, we can just say the solution, singular, is x1, and otherwise we can say the solutions are, plural, x1 and x2. Okay. So again, you guys have written a quadratic equation solver before. Notice how much more streamlined this code is. So it's sort of clear that, okay, I'm going to get the three coefficients because I need to for a quadratic equation. And then right here you might want to comment and say, create two variables to store these solutions. So now another programmer comes in and says, oh, okay, so these two variables here are going to capture the two potential solutions. And then, oh, if there is no solution, right, because I'm taking the square root of a negative number, if there is no real solution, I tell the user that. Otherwise, though, what do? I just solve the quadratic equation. So this function is named in a helpful English fashion, right? So another programmer says, oh, I know what's happening here. They're going to solve the equation with these three coefficients, right, a, b, and c, and x1 and x2. What is that? Oh, yeah, he told me up here that he created those two variables to store the solutions. So he's passing the three coefficients to the function and also passing a couple of variables that will capture the solutions. Okay, so let's just see if this works. So let's hand it 1, 2, and 4 or something. Okay. Let's end at 1, 2, and -4. And it gave me a couple of solutions, right? Let's hand it something that we know only has a single solution, 1, 0, and 0, that only has the solution 0. Okay. So this works just like the program you guys have written before, except now it's been streamlined and the task of actually solving the equation has been separated out, down here. So that makes main more streamlined. And again, some of you had trouble seeing the logical structure of this program when you first wrote it. And part of the reason you had trouble seeing the logical structure was because this was one of the first programs you wrote. So when you're a beginner, it can be difficult to see the logical structure. But here now, with it so streamlined, you can see exactly what's happening. Okay, create a couple of solution variables. If there is no solution, I should say there's no solution and stop. On the other hand, though, if there is a solution, well, then I should solve the equation. If there's only one solution, then I should use proper English and say the solution is. And if there's more than one solution, I say the solutions are. And that's it. Now you can solve a quadratic equation. Okay, so the main reason I showed you this example is because you will see this in practice all of the time. If you want to trick a function into returning more than one value, which is what we've done here, we've tricked the function into returning two solutions. One way you can do that is by passing by reference and not having any official return values at all. So this is a void function, so officially this function returns nothing. But unofficially, through trickery, you're forcing it to return two values. Okay, so there's one example of that. You want to write a function that solves the quadratic equation this. You need a function that returns two values sometimes, so make a function that does that by passing by reference. The final reason you would want to pass something by reference is because you want to save memory. So this isn't really an issue for us because the goal of this course is not to turn you into a professional programmer. The goal of this course is to get you comfortable with the logic of the foundational concepts of computer science. But just be aware of this, that in practice, a lot of times programmers will pass by reference because they want to save memory. So what do I mean by that? So let me come back up to this example here. In this example, you have some string up in main that you've already declared, and you pass the value of that string to this function. And then what does this function do? It creates a new variable, a new string variable, to store the value you have passed to it. And it stores it right here. This function, on the other hand, though, does not create a new variable. So whatever string variable you have in main, you are handing this function that variable. So this function here, where you are passing by reference, you don't need to create a new variable. And that saves memory. Every time you create a new variable, you now have to allocate memory for that variable. You have to create space for it. So this function right here requires, half of the memory of this function. Because this function, you have to have a variable going in main already, and then you create a new variable inside the function. But this function here, you don't create a new string variable inside the function. So you've saved some memory. And so you guys don't have to do this, but in a computer science course that's training professional programmers, the instructor will sometimes say, always pass a vector by reference. Okay, because a vector is, in some sense, if you have a vector with 1,000 entries, that vector has 1,000 different variables inside of it. So if you pass that vector by value, now the computer has to make a new vector with 1,000 entries in it. And so, you already had memory allocated for 1,000 entries, and now if you pass by value, you have to create new memory for another 1,000 variables, So if you have a program that has a bunch of vectors and the vectors are all long, and you start passing by value, you're going to start eating up a ton of memory. So keep that in mind. In practice, you will see vectors or arrays a lot of times passed by reference always. And the reason programmers do that is to save memory. Yeah, so I say some here, programmers always pass a vector by reference. this sum here is like 95% of professional programmers. So basically all programmers pass a vector by reference. Okay, so let me end with a sort of simple function just to illustrate switching values of variables. So let me come back up here in main, and let's say that you have a couple of variables floating around, and maybe you have gotten both variables from values of variables from the user. And suppose now you want the value of x to be y and the value of y to be x. Okay, what would that look like? Well, let's just create, a couple of dummy copies of y. So make a copy of x, make a copy of y, and then you can say, oh, let y now have the value that x has, and let x now have the value that y has. Okay, and there you go. You've switched the value of the variables. So this is not a particularly hard task to do, right? But again, if your goal is to make your code streamlined, and your goal is to make it so that main is as English-friendly, as user-friendly as possible, then you'd like to just have one simple line of code in main that looks like this. Oh, I got these values from the user, and I want to switch them, you know. Or maybe I'll do like this. Switch value of, or something, right? So make it really English specific. So of course the computer is yelling at me because it doesn't know what this function is, right? But again, in main, you would just like all of this suppressed, because why bother doing that in main? And now another programmer can come along and say, oh, okay, what he's done is he's switched the values of x and y. Okay, so let's just make a function that does that. So up here, I don't need to return anything, and I'm just going to pass the values by reference so that changes are remembered inside of main. Let me now just come down here, and let me just write exactly what I had in main, but now it's separated out. So just make some copies. A equals x, b equals y, and now just swap the values. So x now is b, and y now is a. And you're done. So now back up here in main, what will happen is the values of x and y have been swapped. So let's just see that. So let me just enter the numbers 2 and 3. And now it swaps them, right? X has value 3 after you do this little function, and y has the opposite value. Okay, so we're going to spend some time dealing with all of this. We've now done a lot of function things. You know, you can pass by value or by reference. You can pass whatever you want. You can now basically return anything you want, including returning nothing. So we have a lot of concepts bouncing around now involving functions. So we're going to be spending more time on them. But for now, this is all I have to say about passing by reference versus passing by value.